Oh, hey, whoa.
And we're broadcasting.
And we're live.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another in a series of panels for VirtuaCon 14, a completely online, completely free tabletop role-playing game convention sponsored by RPGgeek.com. This panel is titled Lay of the Land and is intended to be a survey of different role-playing game genres, some high points and low points, general overview of the state of the tabletop hobby. If you're watching this live during the convention, we have a Q&A function set up, so you can post any questions you might have for the panel, and we will do our best to answer. My name is Steve Sigety. I'll be the moderator for this panel. I'm a librarian and library instructor. I've played and GM'd for more than 25 years, and I blog about games, movies, and books at kaijuville.blogspot.com. Most of my experience is with traditional RPGs, but I've tried several newer indie-style games, and our group has drifted some of those mechanics into some other games. So I'd like to introduce our panel, and I'll go in order as I see them on my screen from left to right here. Derek Stoelting is the Unisystem line editor for Eden Studios and editor for Elflair Games. You can see his work in books such as The Worlds of the Dead, Book of Archetypes 1 and 2, Eden Studios Presents, and Eldritch Witchery. His upcoming works include Volume 2 of Worlds of the Dead, more Book of Archetypes and Eden Studio Presents, and he's doing his part to update a core book for future release. By day, he's a control analyst for a Fortune 500 company.
Good morning,
Derek.
Steve. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Keith, I was going to ask you how to pronounce your last name.
It's Mageau.
Mageau, okay, very good. Keith Mageau is a veteran. He's a father of 2 and a grandfather of 1. I wouldn't have guessed that, sir.
That's okay, most don't.
He has been gaming on and off for 30 plus years and has jumped back into gaming with both feet about 13 years ago. He enjoys fantasy and sci-fantasy genres, but he's looking to explore new genres like horror, and he has his dislikes too. And so we'll probably talk about some of those. He's the creator of a fairly new blog, rollingboxcars.wordpress.com. So welcome, Keith.
Thank you for having me.
Lowell Francis is a freelance writer, editor, and gaming enthusiast. He's a podcaster with Play on Target podcast, which is the unofficial RPG podcast.
Yeah.
He is a contributor to the Eisner Award-winning book Legends of the Guard, IDW's Rocketeer Adventures, and he's a scripter for DC's Flashpoint Project Superman series. His blog is ageofravens.blogspot.com, where he also posts about the history of role-playing game genres as part of his Patreon project. So welcome, Lowell.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
And thank you all for being here. I should also mention that Derek, Lowell, and I are in the same local group of gamers, so there's some familiarity there. And we're all on the Eastern time zone, so this is a little early for all of us. So
it's not the 2 a.m. panel that I had, so...
Oh, goodness.
6 is good.
Excellent. All right, well, I thought we might start by just briefly going over some of the main genres of different role-playing games and maybe talk about what we feel are some of the best games in those genres. Maybe talk about a miss, something that maybe didn't quite hit the mark. So I'll open it up a little bit just to talk about how do we define genres and how do we point those things out? What sort of separates those things, the different tropes? So I'll just open that up.
I think one of the difficulties that I've had as I've gone through working the history list of the different genres. So now I've done horror, I've done samurai, I've done superhero, I'm working on post-apocalyptic, and I've done the steampunk and Victoriana. And we've got a lot of areas. The steampunk and Victoriana one is one of those cases where there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of bleed through, and we're seeing more of that, I think, in the last 10, 15 years as game designers try to find new approaches, and the sort of classic conventions of genre, where we go, okay, well, that's obviously a supers game, and that's obviously a fantasy game, have really started to bleed, where people go, oh, you know what, I've got a zombie thing I want to do, and let's do superheroes. So we get, Torn Capes, which is this sort of weird cover over, and a lot of the steampunk games, I can't tell where the steampunk ends and the fantasy begins, or whether steampunk is just a label. And then you get something like Numenera, and I don't know exactly how you pitch / describe that to someone. So I will say, yeah, the last 20 years has been a real bleed of those things as the hobby's matured. Keith, how do you describe Numenera?
I describe it as genre bending. It's not quite science fiction, and it's not quite fantasy. When Monty Cook pitched the Kickstarter, he was labeling it as sci-fantasy, and again, that's that genre bending where we've diverged from traditional fantasy, we've diverged from traditional science fiction. They've kind of met in the middle, and you end up with Numenera, which to me is a really good game, mechanically, thematically. But like Lowell said, how do you define that long term? Because it's really the only one of its kind as science fantasy. I mean, you have some that are science fiction that border on it. You have some that are fantasy that can border on it. But it is a one of a kind at this moment.
That's probably true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see more of that as the RPG industry continues to roll. And despite what a lot of people like to say, the industry is not coming to an end. I think we're in another upswing right now with the number of different games that we've got coming out as you start to see things bend like that. I mean, one of the things that I kind of jotted down as an idea for Steve's little panel here was the fact that we're seeing a lot of how do I run this other game with this other game's rules. I've seen that over the years many times, but I've seen a big uptick in the number of people who are starting to do that kind of, hey, I want to talk about this online again. So I think we might see more of, taking an idea like what Monty's developed and published. I think you might start to see that other places in the next year or two, and I hope so, because it's a new type of thought process. I think it'll help define some of the things. Like it might define steampunk a little bit better if people go down that road. Maybe not. We'll see. But it's encouraging because it's, in one way, it's a new genre, which means new customers, which means more fun for more people.
And maybe in a way too, some of the new distribution areas such as Kickstarter, Indiegogo, RPG Now, people can get those ideas out in a way that they probably couldn't before with going through a publisher.
There's a thing here is there's a risk aversion for big scale publishing that you want to have a minimum, and you want to know that a lot of people are going to be able to buy it, and you want to be able to sell it. Whereas the drive-through approach and even the Kickstarter approach, you can go, here's my crazy ass house campaign that jams together, My Little Pony and Cyberpunk, and we've enjoyed it. And now I can publish it, as a PDF, with laser eye ponies, or I can do a Kickstarter and it's marketing, and I can find 300 William Gibson bronies that will buy this product, and that's a real change. And I think that one of the things is to see kind of the scale of the stuff that's coming out. I think that the pie is getting split in a lot more ways, but at the same time, gamers are actually buying a lot more things. I think a lot more smaller, discrete RPG products.
Okay. So if we want to talk about different types of genres, maybe the 800-pound elephant in the room. I'm going to mix some metaphors there. For fantasy, the fantasy genre, that seems to be where the hobby started early on, and there are tons of games in the fantasy genre. What do you think are some of the highlights for that?
Well,
Yep.
I'll go ahead and go first as
Okay.
the non-big fantasy person in the room. I think the big highlight, of course, is 5th edition coming out and the success it has had. I know there's been some misses. There's going to be misses with every single publication. But the fact that, you know, Merles was able to get the game out, a lot of people seem happy with it. Of course, there's always going to be detractors. I think it's fine, and I think that any success that Merles has with that is only going to help other people. And other companies have said that. So you've got, of course, the D&D. Pathfinder continues to roll along. If you want to bend and push forward the time and the age of, say, a fantasy game, you've got Witch Hunter 2nd Edition from Paradigm Concepts. It just came out at Gen Con. If you scroll it back a little bit, you've got the fact that 13th Age from Pelgrane Press continues to push its way through, continues to be successful. The game's still coming out, and it's expanding. You've got a Gloranthan 13th Age that's currently up in Kickstarter, doing very well, so I think you're good there. And I think that's all off my quick list of things I thought about as far as fantasy goes. So, I think watching 5th edition and seeing what they do is only going to give other people more ideas and spur it along.
Yeah, I think Derek's right with the the resurgence of the new edition of Pathfinder. I mean, that is, that's the big gorilla, as it were. But I mean, there's lots of other games within the genre that really, from the past to the present, that really, epitomize the genre. Like for me, one of my first fantasy games was D&D in the 80s, the very early 80s, and I still play it to this day. But outside of that, classical example, I like the King Arthur's Pendragon. That is one of those games that that's very near and dear to my heart. I still play it after all these years. But even like I said earlier with Numenera, is it fantasy? Is it science fiction? It has elements of both, and it fits well within the fantasy genre. You have a lot of this resurgence of the OSR, the old school revolution, of games that's like that subcategory of the fantasy genre. With games like Labyrinth Lore, Dungeon Crawl Classics. I mean, these are taking center stage within their own little niche community, but they do fit right there in that fantasy overarching, genre. I mean, there are misses out there, like Derek alluded to, but I think with every product, no matter who the publisher is, who the author and designers and developers are, you're going to have those products, and you just as end users like we are, you roll with the punches, you take the good with the bad, you exploit the good, you negate the bad, and we all have fun.
What's interesting is, for me at least, I'm just going to talk over Steve.
Fine.
Is fantasy still remains kind of that defining battleground in terms of staking a position about what games are about. So we've got the mainstream stuff, the Pathfinder, the D&D 5e, 13th Age, but interesting how much the newer stuff, 13th Age and D&D 5e, are borrowing from other sort of design elements, indie games and even old school games. That there's a shift there, but you've got these staked out territories. Let's call those the big games. You've got OSR, which contains a vast multitudes of different stuff, but you've also got a real move of people who might have poo-pooed fantasy years ago, of indie games moving back to kind of pull back and find new takes on fantasy, because fantasy is, as you say, the 800-pound elephant in the room. And so you get, that of Apocalypse World, various versions. Dungeon World, I think it's not necessarily my cup of tea, but it has the longest legs. It's grabbed a lot of people's attention. If people talk about it, they do stuff with it. It's become a very interesting move, and I think maybe pull back indie people to it. And other experiments. Keith can speak to this. Torchbearer is a marriage of a lot of indie sensibilities to fantasy tropes in a kind of different way, and it's interesting to see that in some ways to really make a statement about game design. I think a lot of designers try to figure out how to do fantasy, and that's really interesting, and taking new things. Now, Keith, I am going to ask you, what is Torchbearer doing that's so different?
I think, at least from what I'm seeing, it takes that very classical trope of fantasy. It is a fantasy game at its heart, but the mechanics of it are Indian nature. So we have things like, instead of just being damaged, in some kind of combat resolution, you don't necessarily get damaged. You have conditions, sick, hungry. These conditions equate to damage in a more classic sense, but they are just the application of it and the concept of it is new and revolutionary in design. Started with Burning Wheel, and then moved on to Mouse Guard, and now has moved on to Torchbearer, which is self-proclaimed, the designer Thor is playing, it's an homage to original D&D from the mid-'70s, where he started. So you're seeing, again, that genre bending. You take the classic fantasy element, you take, as you said, Lowell, indie sensibilities, you kind of mash them together. And you end up with things like Torchbearer that find the best of both. Torchbearer's got a lot of other things going for it. The rules are kind of crunchy, so you have some resource management that second edition AD&D tried to bring in that everybody kind of ignored, but it's an integral part of Torchbearer that can't be ignored. So it's crunchy. It's got lots of that indie element to it. It has lots of the fantasy element to it. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, no, it does, absolutely.
But all in all, I'm still working through the rules on it. I've played Mouse Guard a time or so, and I like what I see. So I'm really excited to get that to the table in the upcoming weeks.
Excellent. I'm going to chime in on some titles that maybe we passed over here. RuneQuest and Legend, of course, and then OpenQuest as well. So we've got those D100 games in there as well. I sort of feel like maybe my role is like the old McLaughlin group. John McLaughlin would come in at the end. Everyone would give their opinion, and then John McLaughlin would come in with the correct answer. Right.
I think what's interesting about the OpenQuest and the BRP stuff is how much that has splintered and fragmented in with the whole Mongoose Chaosium stuff. Mm-hmm. And I would be hard pressed. Derek ran Legend for a while, but there are so many competing versions of that base system. It's kind of crazy.
And there are some other ones too, including Bare Bones Fantasy is also another D100. I think that's a little bit slimmer than something like RuneQuest, but there are quite a few. That's a good point. That area has sort of splintered into all sorts of different directions. Okay. How about sci-fi? What about sci-fi games? What are some examples and some tropes for that genre?
I think what's interesting about sci-fi is a little bit like superheroes. We used to have really strong defining games. Traveler was the sci-fi game, and maybe people would point to space opera or even Star Frontiers, depending on their generational thing. But I'm not sure that there's a good, solid, present-day defining sci-fi game. there's some interesting modern ones, and Traveler's still around. But I don't think there's anything that does sort of sci-fi, big picture sci-fi. The closest I would say to wanting to be the torchbearer, as it were, for what's your standard bearer is maybe Eclipse Phase. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Sci-fi seems a game that people are really uncertain about these days.
I think Eclipse Phase does do that, except that they had a slowdown this past Kickstarter, and I think that irritated some folks. You've also got Fantasy Flight with Dark Heresy, with Star Wars. Margaret Weiss is punching back with Firefly, but obviously, I mean that's definitely another genre bender with the Western elements in it. So I think you're right in that the sci-fi is a little nebulous right now because you've got to decide what flavor you want with it. Do you want horror with it? Do you want more fantasy with it, like Shadowrun 5th Edition that's out there and still successful right now? And Steve, by the way, I'm a little upset that you left Blood Tide, Black Sails, and Dark Rituals off your list of fantasy stuff. You should have actually. You didn't call out the pirate game there, sir. But
I apologize.
But no, I think much like the D100 games right now, I think there's developing material, and I think we're in a phase of growth where you're not going to see a definitive thing. The follow-up to Numenera is definitely a little bit more sci-fi looking to me. I apologize, I don't remember the name of the game right now. So I think there's a lot of stuff out there, and I think it's just going to take some sales numbers to come in to see where people are really going with it, and maybe they're not going anywhere with it. Maybe the next one out that looks big to me is going to be Last Parsec from the folks at Pinnacle, and maybe that'll be what defines it. I'm not sure on it. Keith, what do you think?
Not being generally a sci-fi guy myself, I mean, I have played a smattering of stuff over the years. I don't know how you would, for me, to truly define the genre. Lowell and Derek hit it pretty well. It's kind of nebulous. It's very wide, and there's lots of small press stuff. There's some big press stuff. The Star Wars. The Shadowruns, the Travelers, even Numenera. Bruce Cordell's new game, The Strange, which is the follow-up to Numenera. Is it fantasy? Is it sci-fi? Is it horror? It mashes up. Just you name it, it can mash it up. And I think for me, sci-fi is that genre that it's a genre without a genre. Because I mean, what truly defines sci-fi? We can mash up everything. I think Derek said it well. Do you want horror with it? Do you want cowboys? I mean, do you want an opera like Lowell alluded to? Something like Star Blazers. So what really is the genre? Maybe the Last Parsec will define it. Maybe Shadowrun or Traveler is truly the defining game. But I would say time will tell. But we've been running a long time in the sci-fi genre. Going back to the early '80s, and for me, anyways, there's no one really defining game like D&D is to fantasy. I don't know what is to sci-fi.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
I would have said Traveler years ago, but it's so split apart.
Yep.
And it's interesting. You mentioned the Firefly and the Star Wars and stuff, and there's this weird thing in my head that I think of those as their own weird beasts. I think of Cyberpunk as its own thing outside of sort of straight mainstream hard sci-fi, and so I boxed that out weirdly, which is probably a mistake on my part. I will say the one game I've read that I think could be the equivalent of Traveler because it is written so broadly and yet has enough crunch is that Mindjammer from Sarah Newton, which uses fate as its basis. But man, if you wanted a default sci-fi game done in one book, I think that game offers it better than any other. But it's fate, which is not a lot of people's cup of tea, and so I don't think it will necessarily take the kind of if you say sci-fi, people assume, well, you're going to be playing, X, unless you say otherwise, like with D&D.
Right. We've got a list of a couple other ones that I don't know that got mentioned. There's a Kickstarter going on right now for The Last Parsec, which is a Savage Worlds sci-fi setting. I don't know too much about it. I didn't look into it, but I know that Kickstarter is going on right now. Fading Suns, and that's one that sort of goes across sci-fi and fantasy.
And a new edition that just came out of that at Gen Con, and I don't see people talking about that at all.
No. And also Stars Without Number, which is an OSR game. It uses the Moldvay basic rules, but it's been a very popular sci-fi setting as well. Okay.
Yeah, now that you say that, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. Diaspora, Ashen Stars. There's the Hot War, Burning Empires. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost so broad I lose perspective on the genre.
And not necessarily ones that I see people talking about very often, either. At least as far as in my circles.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, I think you hit on something when you said, the Last Parsec from Pinnacle. It's a Savage Worlds game. Savage Worlds, has become a genre name unto itself, like D&D. You say D&D, you think fantasy, which is great. But then when you ask somebody, hey, what are we playing? Well, we're going to play, a Savage Worlds game. And then it's like, what flavor are we playing? And I think we run into a lot of that I think that crosses over to sci-fi. Hey, we're going to play a sci-fi game. Well, what are we playing? The rules system, like Lowell alluded to with Mindjammer and Fate, the rules system is starting to define what the genres are. D&D, whether it's the old school style of D&D or the more modern D20 version of D&D or development growth of it, that's beginning to define the fantasy genre, for newcomers, new folks, even some of us old folks. You say sci-fi, and I say, well, which flavor? You say, hey, we're going to play a Savage Worlds game. I say, well, what flavor? Because, and I think we're starting to see a lot of bleed over from rule systems, where the rule systems are becoming the defining element of a genre, even whether it's a very small niche genre or a broad spectrum. That's just something I'm seeing.
Here's the interesting thing is, I wonder if that Savage Worlds and Fate, taking that role, if that's because of a change in terms of communication in the last 10 years, because I don't think you would have gotten that with, say, Champions, Hero System and stuff like that, and even GURPS. I don't think never became that sort of default in the way that Fate and Savage Worlds have, at least in their narrow G+ and online gaming conversations.
So you had mentioned Cyberpunk earlier, Lowell. So let's take a look at that. What would you think some of the defining games are for Cyberpunk, and some of the defining tropes for that style of genre?
Well, I think that the problem with Cyberpunk is that it has been bit by the future coming too fast. In some ways, you go back and you look at Cyberpunk 2020, and it feels very, very dated on a lot of scores. I mean, all of that tech stuff, and I imagine people are a little more hesitant about that. Though we've gotten some more exciting things in recent years. I'd say Shadowrun manages to survive because it is so unreal. It doesn't try to have any kind of real world connection like Cyberpunk 2020 did. So, they don't care that the computers, are 128K in the domain book or whatever. That kind of thing.
Derek?
It's sci-fi. For me, it's second nature. I'm just going to drop in whatever I want to drop in and go with it. For me, it's it's as easy for me to run as it would be for me to say that I know how easy it is for Lowell to run, say, fantasy. So, we can define it how we want to or not define it. I tend towards the harder end, but whatever.
Mm-hmm. So maybe more hardware, Chrome style?
Chrome, combat, guns, crunch. I think that helps define it. But I also think it's a genre that doesn't exist anymore. I think the genre of cyberpunk, what it was, has moved on, and I think that's what it's struggled with to remain relevant as a new product. And we'll see whatever the new version is when it hits the streets. If it gets picked up or not. But I think Shadowrun is closer to what people want. I think Eclipse Phase is closer to what people want from that genre.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Steve Jackson certainly tried to find the next phase for cyberpunk with the whole transhuman space, which then Eclipse Phase kind of built on that. But the other direction that I think it's gone, where it's survived, is a certain amount of anime trope versions of it. Mecha takes on it and that kind of thing.
Keith?
Yeah. Keith, what do you got?
I don't know. For me, the whole cyberpunk is, for me anyways, because I've played Shadowrun. I haven't played a lot within the genre. To me, Shadowrun is my go-to game. Not necessarily to run, but to play when I want to do something that doesn't care, like Lowell alluded to, all the real tech crunchy bits of modern world, because it is so kind of far out there. And to me, anyways, in this, what little I've played in this genre, the game just bends and is flexible enough that I don't care that the computer on my wrist, if I'm playing like a jacked character, is not even as powerful in theory as my cell phone. Conceptually it works with the game, and that's what I want in the game, as long as the concepts work and I'm enjoying the mechanics for the most part. And the story, that's what's important. As far as Cyberpunk 2020 and the anime introduction with the mecha stuff, it's not much my cup of tea. So for me, anyways, like I said, it's going to be Shadowrun's going to be my go-to game. But it's, I think Lowell alluded to it. The cyberpunk genre is another. It's a splinter group or splinter genre of sci-fi, because its parent is in sci-fi more than it is anywhere else. I don't think it's a group unto itself anymore, like Derek, mentioned. It's kind of ceased to exist, and it's been absorbed, I think, back into its parent group. You say, people will associate Shadowrun either with fantasy or with science fiction. Not necessarily a cyberpunk is its own genre anymore. 10 years ago, yeah, maybe so. 20 years ago, absolutely. But today, not so much.
Okay. I know we have a new edition of Shadowrun that just came out, the 5th edition. There's also a Savage Worlds setting, Interface 0, which is fairly recent. I don't know very much about that at all. So it'd be interesting to see what their take is on moving those cyberpunk tropes forward in the timeline.
They came out with a new edition of Zero Phase. I think it's a 2nd edition, so I think it's been around for a while.
Okay.
Again, it's not a genre I delve into, so I can't elaborate on it. I've kind of thumbed through the older stuff at a local game convention when the product manager was at the convention. But other than that, it's science fiction to me.
Right. It might be fun to go back and do something like a cyberpunk game, but using those 80s style tropes, as if the future imagined through an 80s lens, maybe.
So there's an old school Mirror Shade Renaissance that you want to start up, Steve? Right. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly.
That's exactly what I heard. Steve's going to lead the way on that. He's going to carry the banner for us.
Come on, Steve, put them on. They're at your desk.
Right. Which is interesting because I've never played in a cyberpunk game, so I find it really interesting, but I just haven't played before.
I think one of the ways to kind of look at the viability of a particular genre is to look at, if you go back to the last 3 years worth of Kickstarter RPG products and see how many projects in that genre have appeared. And the only one I can think of is the Strands of Fate Nova Praxis one is the one that sort of comes to mind. There's also like tech noir, which I've heard of, but I don't know what it's like.
And I think maybe, forgive me, I forget who mentioned it, but maybe going more into the sort of transhuman style play of more transhuman sci-fi near future. Maybe that's where that genre is headed. So I think that's an interesting point. So going from that cyberpunk genre, maybe talking about any kind of post-apocalyptic genre style. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, lol.
Yeah, lol.
See, now here's a really interesting thing is there's been a really interesting shift in how we define the apocalypse. And when you go back, and I took a look at those early games, and in almost all the cases we get in the apocalypse early days, it's all nukes. In some way, shape, or form, it is a nuclear event, things like that. There's some other attempts to it, but that is clearly, those of us who grew up, in the 70s and 80s, that was the shadow hanging over us, and defines how post-apocalyptic fiction gets talked about. And then, of course, you go back and all of the big science fiction works in the genre. The Final Shore, and A Boy and His Dog, and A Canticle for Leibowitz, and all of the big books in the genre, they're all about that. You get to modern day, and that's changed quite a bit. And the 800-pound undead elephant in the room for things is zombies. And the number of zombie games that are trying to do all flesh must be eaten one better is kind of amazing. But the apocalypse has changed. A lot more viral. The last edition of Gamer World was all about reality warping and stuff. But now I've kind of rambled around that. I think the most interesting maneuvers, the most interesting movement is what Apocalypse World does. Most of the early Apocalypse games are about survival, but they're primarily then that's coupled with exploration. It's coupled with exploration and monster fighting. There are things that you go on. You look around the world, you do that, and search around. Apocalypse World is about survival and the community survival and that strong character interaction in a way that very few Apocalypse games are before that. The closest would be the very intimate zombie survival games. Some of the classic first all flesh must be eaten scenarios that are less about the zombies outside and more about you've got 8 guys stuck in an elevator, what are you going to do, kind of tight survival. And Apocalypse World goes in a different way, and it is an apocalypse game where hell is other people, but it's also the only real resource that you have.
Derek?
Yeah, I'll avoid as much as I can shilling for the company here, but the zombies is the new thing. They've replaced sparkling vampires. I'd like to say that Eden Studios got started on the genre before it became the mod thing that it has become. But yeah, it's different. It's there's no longer a mushroom cloud hanging over our heads, as it were. It is the virus. It is those kind of problems. It is as much as the TV show has dated itself, the X-Files of the world has kind of come true in a way. We worry about the government controls. We worry about the government experiments. You see that stuff all over the place. You look at things like chemtrails. Um, I don't follow the conversation, but it's a very popular conversation in some circles. So I think for the apocalypse setting, you're almost going to get stuck with that. Now we've got Fantasy Flight's got a game they're translating from, I believe it's French, maybe Spanish. That's going to
Spanish.
be Spanish. Thank you. That's going to go after that topic, but they're going to do it with 4 different things. And of course, one of them is going to involve zombies, and there'll be alien invasions and things like that. There'll be monsters. Um, and I'm wondering and I'm starting to see some murmurings of it, if we won't see some more kaiju material coming out in the next couple of years, especially with Robert Rodriguez following up on his giant monster movie. I think that could spur some people that way. I think the problem you get there is how do you make it interesting and relevant to have these little humans fighting against giant monsters? Lowell's run some games in that genre and had some success with it. I think he pulled from some very good sources to be successful on that end.
Oh, you know what you should do? Do Mouse Guard. Where the people are the equivalent of mice, but the kaiju are the big animals. That's how you should do it.
Talk about genre bending.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. And if you can figure out how to do that, let somebody know.
Yeah.
One of the 4 of us would be happy to be the middleman for that game and make sure you get published. But yeah, no, I think you can't ignore the zombie. But at the same time, I don't. Other than just starting after the apocalypse occurs and ignoring what happened to cause the apocalypse, I don't know that I see a lot of work through an apocalypse type of setting going on.
Yeah, beyond zombies, there's some brilliant ones out there, and maybe a little bit ahead of their time. I think Summerland is a brilliant, weird apocalypse game where essentially everybody wakes up and the world has been covered by a forest, and it takes up a ways after that. The Tribe 8 is a game that I didn't know anything about, but there were some people on RPG Geek who were advocating for that, and that it looks like a very weird, dense, strange post-apocalyptic game.
I've got the core book if you want to borrow it.
Yeah, I'm very curious about that. There's interesting with post-apocalyptic games, whether the world is completely collapsed or whether it's half collapsed, and what you're doing with that. Cascade Failure is a free RPG that does sci-fi post-apocalyptic, where you're on a colony world and the empire has collapsed, and now you've got to go out and find out what occurred out to cause it. It's interesting because I really am fascinated by post-apocalyptic, but I've never run it. I don't think I've ever run a straight post-apocalyptic game, in part because it does seem a little dark to me.
Well, and how are you defining a straight post-apocalyptic game, and how do you work in? And I think that's something that we could probably spend an hour on at least.
Yeah.
But and how do we? Do you want to play through the apocalypse? Do you want to play through that horror? And what does your group really want? Do they want to dive into the personal horror of it, or they just want to play through the mechanics? Do they want to play through hey, let's mow through some zombies? And if you want to go that route, there's also what is it? Atomic Highway just came out in PDF form. I think it's free for everybody. It's got its own separate Reddit, but there's no movement there. And who knows? Maybe that stuff will pick up once we get Mad Max 2.5, 1.5, whatever it is, if and when it ever comes out.
In several Cthulhu versions of post-apocalypse, Yellow Dawn is a post-Hasturian cyberpunk post-apocalyptic game, and I think there are a couple of apocalypse sort of source books for Trail of Cthulhu that essentially show how you would blow up the world with the Elder Gods.
See, it's that whole genre bending thing again.
Mm-hmm.
You want it, Keith.
Oh, I know. I like the post-apocalyptic. I have yet to delve too far into it. I'm currently playing a game that wasn't mentioned yet, And it's an indie RPG, and it's called The Quiet Year. Playing a
yeah.
play-by-post of that right now on RPG Geek with a couple of folks, and it is years after the apocalypse, and you're stuck, in your little settlement, and you're trying to survive, but the players all have to work together to survive. Mechanically, it's something I've not really delved into, in the past. So it's interesting for me, anyways, to try new mechanics. And I've actually had the game. It's on the shelf behind me back here. Just a little deck of cards and a little tiny rule book. Maybe 16, 18 pages, little pages, and for me, I like the concept in post-apocalyptic. It's after the event. I don't want to go through the event. The bomb blows, or the virus spreads. That aspect of it. I don't want to play through that. I mean, we all know what's going to happen. The bomb's going to blow up. Things are going to go kaboom, or zombies are going to start populating the world. We all know what's going to happen. But I like the idea of playing in the aftermath, the follow-up of it. How do you survive? How do you adapt? But as a genre, it is very like sci-fi. It's nebulous. It's so wide open. Do you want zombies? Do you want the apocalypse world? In the indie side of things, do you want a little bit more storytelling with your game? Do you want a little bit more harder mechanics with your game? I mean, this thing can run anywhere. I guess that can be said for all the genres too, but something that wasn't mentioned too. I think Monty Cook should start paying me for this, but Numenera. I mean, it is, in a sense, it's post-apocalyptic. The world has risen and declined 9 times in the past, and you're playing in the aftermath of the last decline as it's trying to find a way to to rise again. And a lot of the tropes I see in it, and the defining things of the world, the campaign setting, as it were, are very post-apocalyptic in nature. That desolation, that destruction, and people trying to survive in an area that has been decimated by something. Of course, they don't know what that something is. So yeah, to me, anyways, I really want to delve more into the post-apocalyptic. It's got a lot going for it. I can run with zombies. Some of my local gaming group loves All Flesh Must Be Eaten. So that's kind of their go-to post-apocalyptic game when they want to really get fun with zombies. So I'm gonna have to read some more of Lowell's blog and his Patreon, and and delve a little more into this genre for myself, because I think there's a world of experience in it that I can take, whether it's themes or neat little mechanics in some of these indie games, and bring them back into other genres that I do play more regularly.
Cool. A couple of systems that, off the top of my head here, Mutant Future, which is the Gamma World retro clone, and then also Other Dust, which is a companion system for Stars Without Number that is a source book that goes on top of Stars Without Number. I don't know much about that. That looks like very much like a Twilight 2000 style post-apocalyptic game, but I'm not too familiar with that one myself.
You talk about a game that has become dated. There's one.
That would definitely be one that you would play for that. I don't want to say the nostalgia factor, but to play in that mindset, that 80s mindset, and go forward with that.
I don't know, Steve. I think you could almost do it today if you lift the rules and drop it in the Ukraine. I think you've got the game rebuilt all over again.
Jeez.
Very much so. I've heard a bit about the rules, but I don't have any familiarity with them.
They are GDW Classic Crunch.
Oh,
yeah.
Gosh. Well, moving on from the dark future of the post-apocalypse and into something more four-color like Supers. superhero gaming. What are some of the genre tropes involved with that, and some of the main games with supers gaming?
I can
Garrett?
jump in on this.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Keith.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step on you.
Oh no, it's all you.
Supers is one that I don't generally game, but I do have some opinions on it. I grew up, like I had mentioned earlier, in the early '80s, and D&D was, my first game. But we played a lot of Marvel superheroes from TSR, and yeah, it's dated. And I see a lot of resurgence of the genre of superheroes probably in the last 5 or 6 years, much more than maybe 10 years ago. But for me, anyways, Marvel is that original TSR game. For me, is what defines the genre. If somebody says, "Hey, let's play a supers game," first thing I'm going to ask is, "We playing Marvel?" And then partly that's because I know not necessarily the mechanics anymore, but it's a little bit of comfort for me to play that versus Marvel Heroic or the Hero System and throw the supers on it, or any number of these other rotted capes where you're mashing two genres together with the zombies and the superheroes. It's just a little comfort thing for me that if somebody did say, "Hey, I want to play a supers game," I would encourage them to play Marvel superheroes. Maybe a little bit of nostalgia for me, but at the same time, that's to me that's what's always defined the genre.
See, I find that fascinating because around in our area, at least among the groups in the multiple circles, it was we had Champions or V&V, and V&V died off, and Champions had the big market share and mind share around here, and Marvel was never even a runner in that conception. DC Heroes for a little while, but it faded out. But then I talked to people, and for them, Marvel was an important game. It was a game that defined stuff for them, that they ran multiple campaigns in it. They did it for years, and it's so kind of an alien experience to my perception about what superheroes are. And I think that's really cool to see that there are these big core games that did define it for people. The other thing that's weird about the superhero genre today, and there's been an explosion of these games. You see everybody doing this. These are major Kickstarter events. A lot of people, it's not just that they've got a new superhero setting like Base Raiders or Tattered Capes. It's that, or even Cold Steel Wardens is another one. It's that they're actually kind of really reinventing the wheel, and they aren't necessarily providing a setting, but they're going, okay, here's a whole new complete superhero system. And I think maybe more than any other genre, superheroes has become fragmented. Mutants and Masterminds, I think, has some power in the genre, that a lot of people talk about that. But mostly what I see is people going, oh, that's too complicated for me. And it's too complicated, and so then they're talking about Marvel Heroic, they're talking about basic action superheroes, they're talking about supers, they're talking about Fate, and I think that among super gamers today, there's no consensus. There's no game, because Champions is effectively out of the running, except for real grognards and old school people. V&V is back, but that's still very old style. There's like 4C is a Marvel retro clone, but people are going in all completely different directions. I moderate the Supers G Plus community, and people are going. They're all over the place. Icons is another one, but nothing has a hold. And I think superhero gamers probably do bounce around from system to system.
Yeah, I haven't got a lot of experience with the superhero stuff. Most of what I've done is probably closer to World of Darkness run as supers, which is what a lot of the locals around here did, avoiding the actual point of the game. But yeah, I mean, mutants. Oh, in ways you'll never understand, Keith. But mutants and masterminds, the fact that you called it was very complicated or too complicated. I find it interesting because I didn't find it complicated at all. But I started with Chaosium Superworld when I was, I don't know, 8, 10 years old, and then I don't think I touched it again until Champions, and then from Champions I played that for a year or two. They still don't understand the rules and how it all works and what dice you roll when for damage. But then moving to Mutants and Masterminds, I found it a really easy move. But again, hey, the only thing I can say is one of our viewers is calling out Disney Infinity toolbox. He says it's not really an RPG, but it's still a cool thing to look at. So that might be something for people to check out.
Oh, sure.
But that's all I've got on this one.
Okay.
Sorry.
No.
I have kind of a question, I guess. I was thinking about Super's systems, and I was thinking of Scion.
Oh yeah.
Sure.
That would be considered a Super's.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And they're doing a second edition of that. I think we'll probably see a Kickstarter for another version of Scion in the coming year from Onyx Path, which is good because Scion is a great setting and a problematic system.
Okay, I think probably one more here. The horror genre. What are some tropes? What are some of the best games in the horror genre?
Wow, this one's huge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like fantasy, horror is huge. I mean, it is so wide open. I know for me, it's one of those genres that I've always loved, and I'm just delving into it as both a player and a game master. But the two that have really caught my attention is Call of Cthulhu, and even Trail of Cthulhu. Sense the Cthulhu theme here. But those two really have jumped out at me, both thematically and mechanically. But there's so much more. I mean, Derek mentioned, vampire. That whole White Wolf genre, or not genre, but catalog of products fits right in there with the horror genre. I can look over at any one of my game shelves around this room and see something that I can either A, adapt to horror, or B, that it already has horror concepts in it. I've got Cthulhu Invictus back here. I mean, I've got lots of little things that you can mash up. I mean, it's one of those genres and tropes that you can apply it to anything.
Definitely.
And kind of jumping slightly back to the supers, and it all ties in with the horror. I don't know if it was, I think it was Lowell who mentioned it. There was one that was using the fate system. Again, I'm in horror. I mean, I can take a fate system and I can play a horrors game, or I can take the Savage Worlds system and play a horrors game. I'm going back to that whole concept of, I think the systems are starting to, kind of rise in terms of definition. Look at Call of Cthulhu. Look at all the spin-offs of Call of Cthulhu. Cthulhu Invictus. I mean, they all use the same rules in a nutshell. I mean, there are some variations to fit what the particular product is. So it's very, very wide open. For me, anyways, it's an untapped area, kind of like post-apocalyptic. And I'm going to delve into the Call of Cthulhu, the Trail of Cthulhu, but I'm also going to look at the other systems that I'm kind of familiar with Fate and Savage Worlds, and I'm going to look at the overlays of a horror theme just to kind of get myself invested in that genre. Lowell?
There's a whole argument about whether system matters, and I I honestly believe, at least in terms of my play, that more than any other genre, system matters in horror. And some games, Savage Worlds and Fate, are not the games that come to my mind, or even, let's say, Champions, for doing horror, because of either the crunchiness of the mechanics or the competency and the empowerment that they give. I always picture horror as being a game where you are already, kind of screwed at the start, and you're not going to advance too far, and so on. And that's what the revolution that Call of Cthulhu brought. And there's some really interesting games that are doing changes up to the mechanics. I would say everyone owes it to themselves to play Dread once with the Jenga Tower. It's a completely different experience, and it is a game where the system shapes experience and your play in a novel way and creates a huge amount of tension. There's also Epoch, which is a card-driven kind of resource game. It does some very interesting stuff. Both of those striking horror games that manage to blend new system mechanics in to do things. Two other quick points. One, you mentioned Trail of Cthulhu. I think of the stuff that Pelgrane does, Esoterrorist, and especially Esoterrorist Second Edition, gets ignored too much. They go, oh, well, it's a gumshoe game, and they also doing Trail of Cthulhu. Esoterrorist has a brilliant background set up for doing kind of action horror in a modern day, which is really super creepy. It's worth looking at. And we mentioned White Wolf Onyx Path. I think the fascinating thing to look at with all the White Wolf Onyx Path stuff is how much they just don't care anymore about the outside stuff. Onyx, all of that stuff is its own genre. They're able to publish beautiful, gorgeous books for people to read. It used to be 10, 20 years ago, people go, oh, stupid White Wolf games. Now, White Wolf just doesn't care. They have their own thing. They have their own core audience. It is their thing. It's somewhat horror. It's somewhat supers, but they've really built a brand, a boutique brand that's very interesting.
Jared?
Yeah, I'm gonna take what Lowell said about system matters, and also say that sometimes the system matters because it doesn't get in the way. So you can do a game like Dread where it's very important the way that you pull your Jenga piece out. Otherwise, it could be the end of the world for your character. But then you've got other games like White Wolf, where for the most part a lot of the system dies off in the background, and once you're familiar with the game, you run with it and you don't notice it. So that's kind of a nice thing about horror. The big challenge with horror is how do you sustain that every session, and I think that can be hard. You need some ups and some downs, so a lot of that's pacing. I think Lowell's right. I think Esoterrorist is one of those games that is out there that whether you run it in Gumshoe or not doesn't matter, because the second edition book is so far beyond what the first edition book was. You don't need to use the Gumshoe rules to enjoy the game. They've got an update to Fear Itself coming out, which was kind of their first mini horror game, and it's going to draw a lot from, and I forget the gentleman's name. First name is Dave, and if I had Jim, if you're listening, if you can give me Dave's last name, that'd be awesome. But the guy who designed Slay Industries has got another game called The Ocean World, and it's kind of what he's run for his group, and that's kind of being pulled into the background of Fear Itself. It's also what the Book of Unwritten Horror is based on, as some of his stuff. Yeah, so you heard Lowell's reaction there. That's definitely getting into your horror stuff. But I think some of the things we've learned from the 80s and the 90s of games, actually, things like Cult, where it's very hard to run a very hardcore horror game day in, day out. I think we've learned from that. We're developing it into other things as publishers. You don't have that. You have games, an easy example would be a zombie game where, yeah, okay, we're fighting the zombies. Okay, yeah, we've got infighting, but we need more games. And one of the things I'm working on is how do you develop the resource part of it? How do you do the resource management of it? Let's do some lighter hearted things. It doesn't have to be The Walking Dead day in, day out. where it's oh my gosh, more zombies, oh my gosh, we need more food, we're dying, that kind of gets old after a while. Um, but as far as other horror games out there, I think while it's not new this year, I think Night's Black Agent does very well. If you run it as written, does very well. Oh my gosh, there's vampires now. What do we do? You kind of get thrown into that situation, and if you run it as written, it could already be a pretty bad, bleak situation for your character. Especially if you start as burnt spies, things like that. Looking over at the shelf, World War Cthulhu, following on the Cthulhu theme there that Keith started. And right now, that's all that's really over there for me. Everything else is upstairs. But I think you're going to see more stuff. We've got Kickstarter for Chill 3rd Edition out there, and they are changing some of the things that were part of it to the fact that some people are like, I don't know if I want to back it because you're changing some of the background or some of the rules and things like that. So, we'll see what comes out of that. I think it's good. I think it's you got what is it? The East Texas University from Pelgrane came out as a Buffy the Vampire Slayer Pinnacle. There we go. Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets Deadlands. So you've got something you can do there. I've seen some very good reviews of it. I haven't picked it up myself. Probably should just for the fact that it's horror related. But no, I think it's going to continue to evolve, and we're going to see more new interesting things out there. I think the Call of Cthulhu Investigator mode is probably my favorite. Survival horror being the next favorite out of that. But as always, works great for a one-shot. Everybody likes to be eaten by zombies or get killed by the madman.
And the Chill 3rd Edition, that is more the Mayfair version of Chill. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Right. Because I know the original version is available as Crypt World, and that's the old pace setter version.
Minus the setting stuff. There's nothing
minus
about
the setting stuff. It's just the rules themselves.
Yeah.
Right. So that's very interesting. That's sort of a split there too with some of the fans.
And Chill 3rd Edition is being done by a gentleman who's done a lot of writing for White Wolf. So I don't know how much of his style is going to bleed over, and that might be a good thing for it. It might be a bad thing for it. We'll see what happens.
Time's going to tell.
Yeah.
Right. Well, just briefly, this isn't necessarily a genre in itself, but I'm curious to see what you all have to say about this. Kids RPGs, RPGs that are focused on children and playing with younger kids. What would you say about that?
I've seen it, and I know that it exists, but I literally have not looked at any of that stuff. It is a sad thing. I have not. I know there are a lot of them out there, and it's an interesting move. But I grew up, white box D&D. My sister taught me, back when I was 6 or 7. So I don't know about games whether I would have been as interested in a game that was really pitched at kids. I don't know. I have no idea. That's my take on it.
I don't know how much I can add. I mean, I've got a soon-to-be 13-year-old. I've got a 24-year-old, and now I've got a 3-year-old granddaughter who will definitely be introduced to gaming in the coming years. But I don't know that I would, like Lowell said, I don't know that I would take a game that's designed like that. I mean, I grew up in the early 80s playing D&D. You could take something like a D&D or pick any non-horror or post-apocalyptic type of game, and you can make it as simple or as complex. I mean, you can nip and tuck rules to fit an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old. I mean, my 12-year-old, he plays Numenera with me. He plays Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of the OSR stuff, face to face and virtually over G+. And he jumped right in and adapted to it, and I didn't have to strip out or, as some would say, dumb down the rules. I think we as game players, game runners, and even game designers, I think we, or at least my opinion is, I think we expect kids to not be as smart as they are, and we have to dumb things down. And that's I hate to use that term, but I think that's very appropriate here.
He- it occurs to me, and I can I kind of interrupt here.
Sure.
I do think, as old white males as we are, one of the things I do think maybe we do miss is the fact that probably for the younger kids, let's say 8, 9, or 10, fantasy is a completely different thing than what it was for us. And it occurs to me now that like Doe, Pilgrims of the Flying Temple, it is a smart thing because it is grabbing off of what's hot now, the Avatar and Korra, and it is building off of that. And I hope that it's a set of things that potentially could draw in new gamers for the future in a way that straight dragon on the cover might not. I don't know.
No, you make a good point, Lowell. Another thing like with the new Star Wars Edge of the Empire line of games, my son is a diehard. My 12-year-old and both of them are diehard Star Wars fans. So that's something that can grab their attention. Even some of the anime themed stuff grabs their attention. But I don't think taking rules down to the simplest level is necessarily the best thing.
Hmm.
I know as a kid I still don't like to play even board games that are so simple it doesn't cause me to think. I want to think. I want to be challenged, and I know both my boys are that way. They don't mind a little bit of when they were learning role playing games, a little bit of crunch to the rules,
Hmm.
but because it was something they could think about and go, okay, yeah, I dig it, I get it. Now how do I apply it? And then they figure out how to apply it. Um, so some of these, I've seen some games out there, and like Lowell, I have not bought any or really read any. So if I'm doing them a disservice, I apologize. But I have seen some on Drive Through RPG and stuff, and even on Facebook and G Plus that look like they're geared for like 4-year-olds, and I mechanically and thematically, and I don't know that that's doing us a service or disservice to the future genre, or future generations, I should say,
Yeah.
of gamers.
But Derek, Eden has a product that's pitched more younger, right?
Yeah, so we've got Adventure Maximus, which actually has kind of invigorated both George and myself because of its success and how much fun we've had developing it. So it is designed for kids, and it's designed as a way to get them hooked. And I think that's what we need to see is we don't need to dumb down D&D. We don't need to dumb down Storyteller or Exalted or whatever game you want to play and is your favorite, right? We don't need to dumb down Numenera. Um, what we need is just something to hook them in and get them going. It, so a parallel for us was Buffy. We when we did the Buffy RPG, we had a huge influx of female buyers. So okay, so that speaks to something that they enjoyed. Maybe it's because it was based around a strong female character. Um, Adventure Maximus is designed so that I can explain the game to you in 5 minutes, and we can get the game going. We can do in the 5 minutes includes character creation. So the idea is hook the kids, get them interested, get them involved, make it something that's easy. That if I had a kid of my own and his friends were over, I can teach them how to play. I can run them through their first dungeon crawl, and I can walk away. Because at that point, the kids get it, the kids understand, and the kids are going to run it themselves. From that point, hey, Dad, what's this book on the shelf? What's that book on the shelf? I was looking online, and there's this D&D thing, and it seems to be very popular. There's Pathfinder. What are these games about? And that's what we want to do. We want to. Our idea here is to hook in new gamers and bring them in and get them going. And I think that is what we're going to start to see. There's other games out there in development. I haven't actually seen them myself. But that would do it. And we'll see where it goes. I mean, I started with Chaosium's box set of various worlds that I can't remember the name of right now.
Worlds of Wonder.
There you go. The box set's upstairs somewhere. Go for it. Design a game that's for the kids, but don't dumb it down. Kids are a lot smarter than we always give them credit for. They can be a lot more creative than your best game designers that are out there, and they're going to have fun with it. So let them run, let them play.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just want to jump back on this, Steve. Just because I am a parent and I have gone through this with both my kids. Derek, thanks for mentioning the whole. I think you said Adventure Maximus. Did I get it right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Because one of the local conventions that I actually volunteer at, I'm part of the staff, actually wants to run that in June. But to draw those kids in, and that's what it's for. I mean, that's what we need to do as game players, game runner, game masters, game designers, developers, companies. We've got to find what appeals to them. The rules, they can swing up or swing down, but like you said, and I mentioned earlier, we don't need to dumb them down because they are smarter. I mean, I've seen some of the creativity out of both my boys and even my 3-year-old granddaughter, because she's been exposed to gaming in some form since she was born. It's amazing just some of the fantastical ideas that come out of her mouth when she's trying to tell me what she's playing on the floor and stuff. It's amazing. And if we can hook these kids in a positive way into the role-playing genre where they can positively and creatively express what their ideas are, their imagination is, and that's where this genre needs to go,
Hmm.
because it's for the, I don't want to say the survival of the community, because we're on an upswing. Derek mentioned that when we started this off. A new resurgence, but always we have to be bringing in a new generation of players and interested folks. Whether they stay for a few years or they stay for life, kind of like us. Um, but that's how we get them in. We've got to hook them, but definitely don't dumb down the rules. And this is a genre I need to explore some more, just because I didn't use kids-based games like something like Adventure Maximus with my own boys, but I may consider using something like that with my granddaughter when she's a little bit older, as a way to hook her in. My sons were easy because Star Wars, and they liked fantasy stuff, the Forgotten Realms and the Dungeons and Dragons. So that was easy, and I really didn't have to dumb down rules or anything. They just, there was a few little more complex rules that I kind of left out in the beginning, and they jumped right in, and 2 feet, and now they're all hooked. So I guess
And
that's the
there,
father and grandfather's perspective.
and there are other products out there. There's Jonathan Black just mentioned to me over chat that there's a game called Hero Kids, and
Yes.
hey, looking at it, it's a very simple character sheet, which is exactly what you want. It's got a piece of art. It's got a piece of art that the kid, if they want to, can draw on, can color in, draw your own little your sigil for your character on a breastplate, whatever you need to do, things like that. Um, and I think we're getting there. I think we'll have it in the next 2 or 3 years. That will be a defined genre you can use. Steve?
There's also one that is called Argyle and Crew by Ben Gerber, and that uses sock puppets. So that's kind of a fun thing, maybe for even younger kids.
Interesting.
Any, I think we're getting to the end of the time here. Any sort of parting shots about genre in RPGs and maybe sort of the wider field in general?
Here's an interesting idea. Hard military RPGs, Aftermath, Twilight 2000, Delta Force. There used to be back in the 80s a big resurgence, of that kind of stuff. That's a genre we have not seen people do in the last 5 years. Nobody's doing hard military games, with the exception of sort of a Starship Troopers style sci-fi thing. We're not seeing that kind of thing, and I don't know if that's a factor of the times or a factor of game design and a move away from crunch, or what. It seems like something like that, doing an XCOM style tactical combat RPG, could be very interesting.
I would love to see an XCOM style game. That would be really cool.
You should design it, Steve.
Oh no!
Steve should design it. Derek should publish it.
Now I'm on the spot. Keith.
I think my parting shots would be, I'd like to personally, I'd like to see exploration of some more of these, like Lowell mentioned, these little used or little exploited genres. Kind of blow some things out and get some new materials out there. But at the same time, I'm looking forward to seeing some of the two things: the indie mashup, kind of blending two different things here. I'd like to see how the indie revolution comes of age and what it can do for the genres, and see what becomes more mainstream out of it, and what stays kind of that indie cult kind of classic stuff, and more of the mashups. The rotted capes kind of thing, the heroes or the superheroes and zombies, or um, what some of these other mechanical systems can blend together. So those are my kind of parting shots. What I'd like to see in the near future, preferably instead of the far future.
Right. Well, and that's an area that we didn't talk about, but in the indie game realm, there are some games that just either are so defined or they defy genre, where they're very focused on telling a certain story, and that's I'm not even sure if I would put that in genre categories, but it's defined as telling this particular story. Something like Steal Away Jordan, or maybe let's see, Gray Ranks, where they're telling some definite stories, very serious stories, but I wouldn't necessarily consider those genre games. Derek.
Sure. Parting thoughts. The game you want is out there. You just have to find it. It's there's so many different genres and different games and different cross bending, and you can do what you want, and it's out there. And I think it's easier to access in today's world with places like DriveThruRPG, where you can buy all the PDFs in the world you ever want. You've got great resources like RPG Geek, where you can go and you can say, hey, I'm looking to run an all flesh game, but I don't like the rules. I like the idea of zombies, but I want to combine it with superheroes, but I also want to do it in Victorian England. Boom. I guarantee you, within 2 hours, you will have at least one, if not 20, different suggestions of where to go with it. So it's out there. Reach out. Go to places like RPG Geek. Ask questions. Get involved. Have fun with it. Go to conventions. You'll discover local gamers if you're in that area, or you can discover people that you can play games with later on, on group chats, on Roll20, on Google Hangouts. Run with it, have fun with it, and keep rolling the dice, playing the cards, whatever it takes.
Very good. Well, I'd like to thank you all for participating on the panel, and I've learned a lot, and I hope our audience has discovered something new about maybe a genre that they already enjoy, or are prompted to try something completely different. For those of you watching live, enjoy the rest of VirtuaCon, and if you're viewing this later on YouTube, thank you for watching, and check out next year's VirtuaCon. Good gaming. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks everybody.